The danger of self-reliance. The phrase, God helps those who help themselves, is so ingrained in our culture that we don't even question its validity. It seems practical, doesn't it? It speaks to the desire within us to take control of our lives, to feel empowered, to get things done. In a world where independence and self-sufficiency are prized, this saying resonates with our modern mindset. We're taught from a young age that if we work hard enough, if we push through, if we keep going when others quit, success will come. And yet the danger lies in the subtle message behind these words. You don't need God, you can do it all on your own. At first glance, this might not seem like such a bad thing. After all, don't we need to work hard in life to succeed? Shouldn't we be proactive in taking responsibility for our futures? The truth is, yes, we should be diligent and work with excellence. But when this mindset shifts from being diligent to being self-reliant, we create a dangerous barrier between ourselves and the help we so desperately need from God. The core issue with this phrase is that it shifts the focus away from God's role in our lives to our role. It glorifies our own efforts and places the burden of success solely on our shoulders. We are led to believe that we can handle everything ourselves and that God's help is only available once we've done everything we can. It teaches us to believe that we don't need God unless we've tried everything. This is an illusion. Let's be honest. How many times have we faced situations in life where no amount of hard work, planning, or effort could change the outcome? How many times have we fought against situations, tried to fix them on our own, only to end up feeling empty and defeated? For example, think about the times when we've worked tirelessly to make a relationship work, only to realize that no matter how much we invested, the other person was not willing or able to meet us halfway. How many times have we tried to fix our finances, but it seems like no matter how much we save or plan, there's always something unexpected that drains our resources. When we rely solely on ourselves, we are essentially saying, God, I've got this. I don't need you to be involved. And the reality is, we don't got this. None of us have it all figured out. Life is filled with complexities, challenges, and circumstances that are beyond our control. When we place our trust in our own ability to work harder and do more, we neglect the fact that God is the source of every opportunity, every provision, and every breakthrough in our lives. Take a moment to think about the real source of your strength. You've woken up this morning, breathed in fresh air, seen the beauty of another day. Can you honestly say that you earned or worked for that? That you could control the breath in your lungs? The fact that you woke up today is a reminder that God has already given you more than you can ever help yourself to. God is the one who sustains us. He's the one who opens doors and paves the way for us. When we embrace the idea that we can do it all on our own, we shut ourselves off from this divine source. And in doing so, we lose sight of the bigger picture. We are not meant to do life alone. The Bible doesn't support the idea of self-reliance. In fact, it calls us to acknowledge our need for God. Jesus himself said, without me you can do nothing. John 15:15. I also call you nothing. God, come with me. I will call you by your name. That's not just a casual statement. It's a clear declaration of the truth that apart from God, we are powerless. Self-reliance breeds pride and arrogance. When we believe we can do everything by our own effort, we begin to forget the very source of our existence. Think of the story of King Uzziah. He was a king who experienced tremendous success. The Bible says that God helped him to prosper in everything he did. And as a result, Uzziah became strong and his fame spread across the land. But as his power grew, so did his pride. He started to believe that his strength and wisdom were the reason for his success. Instead of continuing to acknowledge God, he became self-reliant, relying on his own abilities to carry out the affairs of the kingdom. Eventually, his pride led to his downfall. He entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense, a duty reserved for priests. And in his arrogance, God struck him with leprosy. Uzziah's story is a stark reminder of what happens when we trust in our own strength instead of relying on God's. When we tell ourselves that we don't need help or that we should just help ourselves, we are setting ourselves up for failure. Not only does it close the door to God's help, but it also opens the door to our own limitations. We cannot see the future. We do not have all the answers. And we certainly do not control the outcomes of our efforts. But when we acknowledge that we need God's help, we open ourselves to a life of partnership with the Creator. Think of a simple metaphor: the relationship between a gardener and a tree. The tree can work hard to grow and produce fruit, but it cannot survive without the gardener's care. The gardener waters the tree, ensures it receives the right nutrients, and protects it from harm. Without the gardener's intervention, the tree would wither and die. In the same way, we cannot thrive without God's guidance, wisdom, and provision. God does not want us to operate on a help yourself mentality, because that mentality makes us believe we can thrive independently. When we do this, we deny the truth of our own limitations. We reject the reality that we are incomplete without His presence in our lives. God calls us to humility. He calls us to surrender our pride and recognize that we are completely dependent on Him for every step we take. When we accept this, we open the door to a life of true strength, peace, and fulfillment. When we stop relying on ourselves and start depending on God, something powerful happens. We begin to align ourselves with the divine purpose for our lives. We stop fighting against the tide and we begin to flow with it. God doesn't want us to be independent. He wants us to be fully dependent on Him, to trust in His wisdom, and to believe that His plan is always better than our own. By rejecting self-reliance and embracing God's help, we break free from the chains of pride and control. We move from a place of striving and struggling to a place of peace and trust. That's when we truly begin to experience the abundant life that God has promised to those who lean on Him. The illusion of control. When we tell ourselves that God helps those who help themselves, we fall into the dangerous trap of believing that we control our own destiny. We begin to think that we hold the reins of life in our hands and that success, happiness, and peace come from our own ability to manage every situation. The phrase subtly convinces us that if we just work harder, think smarter, or plan more carefully, we can achieve anything. It fosters the illusion that we are the ones in control. But here's the painful truth. We're not. No matter how much we try to control our lives, there are forces beyond our understanding, beyond our reach, that shape the course of our existence. We cannot control the circumstances we're born into, the challenges that come our way, or the people who cross our paths. Despite our best efforts, life has a way of humbling us, reminding us that we don't have all the answers and certainly don't control the outcomes. Take a moment and think about how many things in your life you tried to control, only to find that in the end, control was an illusion. Think about the time you worked tirelessly to plan your career path, only for unexpected events or changes in the economy to derail everything you thought you had control over. Or consider the relationships you tried so hard to fix. You invested time, effort, and love, but no matter how much you gave, you couldn't change the other person's heart. We all know the feeling of trying to push, to pull, to control, and yet still feeling powerless when the outcome isn't what we expected. This illusion of control is not only a trap, but it also leads to frustration, anxiety, and even despair. We push ourselves to the limit, believing that it's all up to us. And when things don't go as planned, we feel helpless, hopeless, and overwhelmed. But here's the reality. God, not us, is in control. We may make plans, but God directs our steps. We may work hard, but ultimately it's His will that prevails. The Bible clearly reminds us of this in Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Have you ever worked endlessly towards something only for it to come to an abrupt halt? For example, think about a business venture or personal project that you thought would be your breakthrough. You poured your heart and soul into it. You followed the right strategies. You worked long hours, and you believed this was the key to your success. But then, despite all your effort, it didn't work out. Perhaps the market shifted, or the partnership you relied on fell through. In that moment, you're left questioning, where did I go wrong? Why didn't my plan work? The truth is, sometimes our plans fail not because we didn't work hard enough, but because God is guiding us towards something greater or protecting us from something harmful. Just like a parent who won't give a child everything they want, God sometimes closes doors, not because he doesn't love us, but because he knows what is best for us. What we think is control is often just a fragile illusion that makes us feel secure in the face of uncertainty. But the reality is, true peace comes not from controlling everything around us, but from trusting God's sovereign plan for our lives. We can also see this in the stories of those who experience moments of complete loss, only to later discover that those losses were the very catalyst for something greater. Joseph in the Bible was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused of a crime and thrown into prison. From the surface, it looked like everything in his life was spiraling out of control, but in hindsight, we see that God was orchestrating every detail of his life to bring him to a position where he could save a nation during a time of famine. Joseph couldn't have seen that outcome from his prison cell. His life was out of his control. But it was fully under God's control. The illusion of control creates a false sense of security, but it also keeps us stuck in a cycle of frustration and fear. When we live as if we control everything, we become consumed with anxiety. What happens if our plan fails? What happens if we lose our job, our health, or our relationships? If we think it all depends on our own ability to manage, we live in constant fear of what we might lose. God, however, doesn't want us to live in fear. He doesn't want us to feel like we have to control everything to make sure our future is secure. Instead, he invites us to trust, to believe that he holds the future, that he is bigger than our fears, and that he works all things together for our good. Romans 8:28. When we realize that God is ultimately in control, the weight of anxiety begins to lift. We no longer feel like we have to figure everything out by ourselves. Think of a child and their parent. A child might be frightened about a trip or a new experience, believing they need to control everything. But the parent assures them, "Don't worry, I'm here and I've got this." In the same way, God tells us not to be afraid. He is our parent, our protector, and he has the whole journey mapped out. When we learn to surrender control and trust in his ability to lead us, we find peace that surpasses understanding. But trusting God with control requires a shift in mindset. It requires us to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers, and that's okay. In fact, it's more than okay. It's liberating. It's freeing to know that we don't have to carry the weight of our lives on our shoulders alone. The burden is not ours to bear. Jesus himself says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. Rest is found not in control, but in surrender. When we let go of the illusion of control, we give God the space to move in ways we could never have imagined. One of the most powerful examples of this principle comes from the story of Jesus calming the storm. The disciples were in a boat, caught in a fierce storm, and they feared for their lives. But Jesus, who was sleeping in the boat, woke up and spoke to the storm, saying, "Peace, be still." The storm obeyed. The disciples were amazed, saying, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." In that moment, they realized that even the forces of nature were under the control of Jesus. Their fear was rooted in the illusion that they were in control. But when they trusted him to take care of the situation, they found peace. God is in control. The winds and waves of life may seem overwhelming at times, but we are never alone in the storm. The peace we seek isn't found in controlling our circumstances. It is found in surrendering to the one who has authority over every storm. He will guide us through the chaos, calm the waves, and bring us safely to the other side. The key is to let go of the illusion of control and trust in God's sovereign plan. When we do, we begin to experience a peace and freedom that only comes from knowing that God holds our future in His hands. And that is the kind of peace that changes everything. The call to surrender. When we hear the phrase, God helps those who help themselves, the underlying message is that we must take matters into our own hands, that we must strive, struggle, and fight to achieve our goals. It teaches us that success is the product of hard work alone, and that we must earn God's help through our own efforts. But this is not the message of the Bible. The truth is, God doesn't want us to strive in our own strength. He calls us to something far greater: surrender. Surrender to His will, surrender to His timing, and surrender to His plan for our lives. This act of surrender is not a sign of weakness. It is an act of profound strength, faith, and trust in the one who holds our future. In our world, we are conditioned to be independent. We are taught from a young age to be self-reliant, to stand on our own 2 feet, to take care of ourselves. While these qualities are not inherently bad, they can distort the way we approach God. We begin to think that we need to earn God's favor, that we must prove ourselves worthy of His help. We may even try to carry the weight of our burdens alone, believing that if we just try harder, we will succeed. But this kind of thinking is the opposite of what God desires for us. He does not call us to struggle through life on our own. Instead, He calls us to surrender. What does it mean to surrender? Surrender means recognizing that we are not in control. It means acknowledging that we cannot handle life's challenges on our own, no matter how much we try. Surrender means saying, God, I cannot do this without You. It means trusting that God knows what is best for us, even when the road ahead seems uncertain or difficult. Think about the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. As He faced the agony of the cross, He prayed to God, "Not my will, but Yours be done." Luke 22:42. Jesus, the Son of God, knew that His mission was to die for the sins of the world, yet He still surrendered His will to the Father. He could have chosen a different path. He could have called down legions of angels to deliver Him. But in that moment, Jesus demonstrated the ultimate act of surrender. He trusted God's plan, even though it meant suffering. Through His surrender, Jesus showed us that true strength is not found in fighting for our own way, but in trusting and submitting to God's greater purpose. Surrender does not mean inaction. It does not mean giving up on our dreams or abandoning our goals. Rather, it means aligning our will with God's. It means saying, Lord, I will work, I will strive, but I will also trust that You are in control of the outcome. I will give my best, but I will not carry this burden alone. It's a shift from depending on ourselves to depending on God. It's a recognition that we cannot achieve true success, peace, or fulfillment without His guidance and provision. The Apostle Paul is another example of surrender. In Philippians 3:7-8, he writes, "But whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord." Paul had been a man of great ambition. He had everything: status, education, power, influence. But when he encountered Jesus, he realized that none of those things mattered in comparison to knowing Christ. Paul surrendered his former life, his dreams, his desires, and aligned them with God's will. In doing so, he found a deeper purpose than he could have ever imagined on his own. We see the power of surrender in real-life examples as well. Many people who have experienced true breakthrough in their lives didn't achieve it by striving alone. They reached a point where they had to let go of their plans, their expectations, and their need for control. Take, for instance, someone struggling with addiction. For years, they may have tried to break free from their dependency on their own strength. But it's only when they surrender, when they admit that they cannot do it alone, that they begin to experience true freedom. The same principle applies to our finances, relationships, and health. It's in the act of surrendering our worries and anxieties to God that we experience His peace and provision. Surrender is not a passive act. It's an active choice to trust God with everything. It's a choice to stop fighting against His plan and to allow Him to lead us, even when the path is unclear. It's an act of faith, a declaration that we believe God is who He says He is, and that He is good, faithful, and trustworthy. Many people resist surrender because they believe it's a sign of weakness or defeat. In reality, surrender is an act of courage. It's an act of humility, recognizing that we do not have all the answers and that we need God's wisdom and direction. It's a decision to step aside and let God take the lead. This is not about being passive or giving up on life. It's about saying, I will take action, but I will not control the outcome. I trust God with the results. Consider the story of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. When they were trapped between Pharaoh's army and the sea, they were in a position where no amount of effort could save them. Moses didn't say, let's fight our way through, or let's try to swim across. Instead, he surrendered the situation to God. He raised his staff, and God parted the waters. The Israelites could have tried to fight their way out of the situation, but they would have failed. It was only in their surrender to God's plan that they were able to walk through the sea on dry ground. When we surrender to God, we allow Him to move in ways that we could never accomplish on our own. We might think we're giving up control, but in reality, we are releasing ourselves to the one who has control over everything. Surrender isn't a loss. It's an invitation to experience God's power, His grace, and His provision in a deeper way than we ever could by relying on our own efforts. Surrender also means letting go of our fears and insecurities. It means trusting God even when we don't understand what's happening around us. It's easy to surrender when things are going well, but it's much harder when we're in the middle of a storm. But even in the midst of life's challenges, God is calling us to trust Him. When we surrender, we allow His peace to flood our hearts. We no longer need to be anxious, because we know that God is in control. This is a truth that we can apply in every area of our lives. Whether it's a career decision, a relationship, a health issue, or a financial struggle, surrendering to God is the key to finding peace and direction. We may not always understand why things happen the way they do, but we can trust that God's plan for our lives is always good. And when we choose to surrender, we step into the fullness of what He has for us. The illusion of self-sufficiency. The phrase, God helps those who help themselves, has ingrained in us a dangerous belief that we must be entirely self-sufficient. It suggests that only those who work hard, struggle, and make all the right moves will receive God's help. In essence, it tells us that we are responsible for our success, and God's role is simply to step in once we've done all we can. However, this mindset is not only misleading, it is contrary to the life and teachings of Christ. The truth is, God never intended for us to be self-sufficient. In a world that glorifies independence, self-made success, and personal achievement, it's easy to fall into the trap of believing that we can handle everything on our own. From a young age, we are taught to be strong, to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and to never give up. These ideas aren't inherently wrong, however. They can subtly shape our hearts in ways that distance us from the very source of life, God Himself. When we embrace the belief that we must do it all by ourselves, we begin to lose sight of a fundamental truth. We were never meant to be self-sufficient. Human beings were designed for relationship, not isolation. God created us to be in communion with Him and with each other. When we try to navigate life's challenges alone, we not only deny our dependence on God, but we also miss out on the profound support and strength He provides. Look at the example of the Apostle Paul. In 1 Corinthians 12, 9 to 10, Paul shares a profound lesson. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." Paul, a man who had endured countless hardships, beatings, imprisonments, and shipwrecks, acknowledged that his own strength was insufficient. He recognized that it was through his weakness that God's strength was revealed. Paul's surrender to God's strength rather than his own is a powerful reminder that God's help isn't contingent on how much we can handle on our own, but on how much we are willing to admit our need for Him. There is a lie we often tell ourselves, particularly when things are going well. I've got this. I can handle this situation. I've worked hard to get here, and I will continue to work hard. While hard work and diligence are essential, they are not the ultimate source of our success. God's provision, timing, and grace are what sustain us. We cannot see everything, control every outcome, or predict the future, but God sees beyond our present circumstances. His wisdom is infinite, and His ability to guide us is limitless. A clear example of this comes from the story of the Israelites during their wilderness journey. After they were delivered from slavery in Egypt, they were led into the desert, a place of hunger, thirst, and uncertainty. They could have relied on their own resources, or perhaps tried to help themselves by finding food or shelter. But instead, God miraculously provided for them manna from heaven, water from a rock, and guidance by cloud and fire. Their survival was not based on their own efforts, but on their reliance on God's sufficiency. They needed God in every moment. Their self-sufficiency was a mirage. The true source of their provision came from God alone. In our own lives, we may feel that we've built a successful career, established financial security, or created a comfortable lifestyle. We may believe that these things are the product of our own hard work, and in some ways they are. But the reality is that God has been with us through every success and failure, guiding our steps, opening doors, and providing for us in ways we could never have anticipated. Just as the Israelites depended on God's provision in the wilderness, so we are called to recognize that we are not self-sufficient. We need God at every turn. Let's also consider the metaphor of the vine and the branches that Jesus used in John 15:05. "I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." Jesus was clear. Without Him, we cannot do anything of lasting value. We may have temporary success without Him, but it is fleeting. True success, true purpose, true fulfillment come when we remain connected to the source of life, God Himself. When we attempt to live independently of God, we are like branches severed from the vine, cut off from the nutrients, the life, and the guidance that only He can provide. It's easy to think that we must be self-reliant because the world tells us so. In the corporate world, in our relationships, and even in our faith, the message is clear: be self-sufficient. But that mindset will leave us weary, empty, and isolated. True strength is not in our ability to stand alone, but in our willingness to acknowledge our need for God. When we admit that we cannot do it on our own, we open ourselves up to the fullness of God's power and provision. Self-sufficiency often leads to pride. It whispers to us that we are in control and that we don't need anyone. It fosters the belief that we are the masters of our fate, and while that may sound empowering, it is ultimately a prison of our own making. This illusion of independence leads us to believe that we can carry our burdens alone, only to find ourselves broken and exhausted. God, however, invites us to cast our cares on Him, knowing that He cares for us. 1 Peter 5:7. Think about the times in your life when you tried to do it all on your own. You worked hard, you stayed focused, and you tried to make everything happen, only to end up burned out or feeling unfulfilled. Now think about the times when you recognized your limitations and turned to God for help. In those moments, God showed up. When you stopped striving in your own strength and leaned into Him, He brought peace, direction, and strength in ways you couldn't have imagined. The point here is not to discourage hard work or diligence. Both are necessary. But it is to remind us that hard work without dependence on God is a fruitless endeavor. We must remain rooted in God if we are to bear lasting fruit in our lives. Our success, fulfillment, and peace do not come from our own ability to manage everything, but from recognizing our dependence on God and allowing Him to work in and through us. When we acknowledge that we cannot do it alone, we open ourselves up to the power of God's provision and the peace that comes from knowing He is in control. Self-sufficiency is an illusion. It blinds us to the truth that God is the ultimate provider and sustainer of life. When we let go of the need to control everything and instead place our trust in God, we experience the fullness of His strength, peace, and provision. And in that surrender, we find the true freedom that comes from walking in partnership with the Creator of the universe. As we reflect on the truths we've uncovered today, we must confront the deep reality that the phrase, God helps those who help themselves, is not only misleading, it is spiritually harmful. It fosters self-reliance that distances us from the very source of life and strength, God Himself. It promotes an illusion of control, independence, and self-sufficiency, all of which draw us away from a life of surrender and trust in God's perfect plan. The Bible teaches us that we are not meant to walk this journey alone. We are called to surrender our will, our plans, and our lives to God, recognizing that we are not self-sufficient. We are dependent on His grace, wisdom, and strength at every moment. True success, peace, and fulfillment come when we acknowledge our limitations, lean into His sufficiency, and allow Him to work in and through us. It is in surrender that we find the true freedom of walking with God, knowing that He is in control, He is faithful, and He has a purpose greater than our own. When we let go of the illusion of self-sufficiency, we open ourselves to His miraculous provision, His guidance, and His peace. We no longer need to strive endlessly to earn His favor, for His grace is freely given, and His power is made perfect in our weakness. Today we are called to lay down our false notions of control and independence and embrace the truth that God's help comes not because of our striving, but because of His grace. In surrendering to Him, we find strength, purpose, and peace that the world cannot offer. Let us choose to trust Him fully, to depend on Him completely, and to allow His will to unfold in our lives, knowing that He will never leave us nor forsake us. He is the one who holds our future.